Then we can start now.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. J. Apurva Krishna, and the title of my paper is a study on screening the COVID-19 RT-PCR negative samples for influenza. Influenza is an acute infectious disease of the respiratory tract causing significant mortality throughout the globe. Influenza occurs in sporadic, epidemic, and pandemic forms. The influenza virus evolves continuously with mutations resulting in antigenic drift and antigenic shifts, leading to an ability to cause increased disease severity. The emergence of SARS-CoV-2 in 2020 has shifted the emphasis from influenza to SARS-CoV-2. Prompt detection of influenza virus during COVID-19 pandemic is necessary to take appropriate treatment measures early, for which screening of patients with acute respiratory symptoms for influenza is important. The aim of my study is to detect the occurrence of influenza in SARS-CoV-2 negative population presenting with acute respiratory symptomology. And the objectives are being to screen the COVID-19 RT-PCR negative samples for influenza, to detect the proportion of influenza in COVID-19 pandemic during the period of February to March 2020 and January to April 2021, and to emphasize the importance of screening the patients with acute respiratory symptomology for influenza. Materials and methods that are used during the COVID-19 pandemic. 373 nasopharyngeal swabs received from patients attending a tertiary care hospital with influenza-like illness, which were tested negative for COVID-19 RT-PCR, were included in the study, and these samples were screened for influenza virus using multiplex PCR. The following, the nasopharyngeal swabs received for testing were subjected to real-time reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction following standard operating protocols using ICMR kit targeting influenza A, influenza B, influenza A pandemic H1N1, influenza A H3N2, influenza B Yamagata, influenza B Victoria, and the results were analyzed. A total of 373 specimens were screened for influenza, of which 40, which accounts for 10.72%, were tested positive for influenza. Of the 373 test specimens, 193 specimens were subjected to subtyping, of which 32.5 were typed to be positive for influenza A H1N1, and 15% were positive for influenza A H3N2. This is a bar diagram showing age-wise distribution of the positive cases, and you can see that most of the cases fall into 35-49 age group, closely followed by 20 to 34 age group. And this is a pie diagram showing difference between the positive percentages in both the gender. And you can see that there isn't much difference between the gender. Coming to discussion, in our study that we conducted on 373 SARS-CoV-2 negative samples, we have found that about 10.72% were found to be positive for influenza A, and 89 were tested negative for influenza. From our study, with the sample size of 373, about 10.72% were positive for influenza, of which 100% were positive for influenza A. Of the 100%, 65% were tested to be influenza A H1N1, and influenza B, influenza A H3N2 were 35%, which closely correlates with Mudighetti and et al. With a sample size of 1286. 40.5% were positive for influenza, of which 75.4% were influenza A and 3.60% were influenza B. Of the influenza A, 68.19% were typed to be positive for influenza A H1N1, and 7.27% were influenza A H3N2. From Mudighetti and et al. Study, we can also see that there isn't much difference between between the positive percentages in both the genders, which also correlates with our study, with a female positive percentage being 52% and in males it is 48%. Coming to conclusion, owing to the rapid transmission, case fatality, economic and psychological burden, widely available rapid antigen test kits and RT-PCR for COVID-19, there is an increased testing for COVID-19, brushing aside influenza. The data required to analyze the burden of influenza is minimal in developing countries like ours. Unless screened, a potential pandemic like influenza remains undiagnosed and underestimated. Also, a need for multiplex PCR to screen for other respiratory pathogens should also be considered. And these are my references. Thank you.